Emily, an ordinary waitress, accidentally hugs the wrong man. Brian, a reclusive billionaire with a secret past. What starts as an awkward mistake quickly spirals into a whirlwind of love, betrayal, and redemption. As Emily's world collides with Brian's, secrets unravel, scandals emerge, and both must confront their deepest fears. Is their love strong enough to defy the odds, or will the weight of their pasts tear them apart? Emily stood in the middle of the crowded airport, her heart racing with excitement. She was finally about to reunite with her older brother after months apart. She scanned the sea of faces, her eyes darting across the bustling terminal, until she spotted a familiar figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair. Without hesitation, she wove through the crowd, her emotions overcoming any sense of caution. Reaching him, she flung her arms around him tightly. "Oh my God, I missed you so much!" she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his chest. Except, something didn't feel right. His chest was firm, too firm, and he smelled different. The cologne was sophisticated and woody, nothing like her brother's usual scent. Panic set in as Emily slowly lifted her gaze. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't her brother. Instead, she found herself face to face with a strikingly handsome man in a perfectly tailored suit. His dark hair was neatly styled, his features sharp and elegant, and his piercing gray eyes locked onto hers with a mix of amusement and surprise. Emily stumbled back, flustered beyond belief. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I thought you were my brother," she blurted, waving her hands frantically. "You see, you're tall, and he's tall, and I didn't really look properly. It was just the reflection, the angle, my emotional nearsightedness." "Emotional nearsightedness," he interrupted, his eyebrow quirking. "Yes," she babbled. "When emotions are stronger than common sense, you see what you want to see instead of what's in front of you." He chuckled softly, clearly entertained by her explanation. Before she could retreat further, a large security guard appeared at his side. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" the guard asked in a stern tone. Emily froze. Mr. Carter? The name hit her like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just any man. This was Brian Carter, the elusive billionaire and financial tycoon, and she had just hugged him. I need to find my brother," she stammered, her face red with embarrassment. "And maybe change my name and move to Alaska." She turned and practically bolted, leaving Brian behind. But as she disappeared into the crowd, she couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes following her. Hours later, Emily was back at her job, working the counter at the airport cafe. She moved quickly, dodging impatient customers and making drinks as efficiently as she could. It was just another exhausting day, filled with rushed orders and demanding patrons. She sighed, knowing she needed this job to support herself and her younger brother. "Emily," her manager called, motioning toward a special order. "Table 12, please." Balancing the tray in her hands, she maneuvered through the cafe. When she reached the table, she glanced up and froze. There he was, Brian Carter. He sat casually, his suit immaculate, his gray eyes sparkling with amusement as he watched her approach. "Well, look at that," he said, a teasing smile on his lips. "We meet again." Emily's face turned crimson. "You?" she gasped. "Yes, me," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "And it seems like this time, you're serving me. Funny how things work out, isn't it?" Her hands trembled as she set the cup down in front of him. "Here's your order. Have a nice day." She turned to leave, desperate to escape, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." She paused, taking a deep breath before facing him again. "Yes?" He tilted his head, his expression curious, yet unreadable. "Do you always run off so quickly?" "That depends," she replied. "Do you always sit in the same cafe as someone who accidentally hugged you?" He chuckled, his smile widening. "Maybe it's fate. Or maybe it's an airport with limited coffee options," she shot back, crossing her arms. "Fair point," he admitted, taking a sip of his drink. "But since we've bumped into each other again, can I ask you something?" Emily hesitated, unsure where this was going. If I say no? The unexpected encounter between the two marked the beginning of a connection neither of them anticipated. A simple mistake at the airport had set their lives on an unforeseen path, leaving both of them wondering what fate, or perhaps chance, had in store. Emily knew the question was coming. Brian Carter, sitting there with that amused smirk, wasn't about to let her leave without saying it. "You're going to ask anyway, aren't you?" she sighed. "Definitely," he replied, setting his coffee cup down. His gray eyes twinkled with curiosity. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "Go ahead." Brian leaned forward slightly. "Did you really mistake me for your brother, or were you just in the mood to hug a random stranger at the airport?" Her jaw dropped. "What?" she sputtered. He shrugged nonchalantly. "You seemed pretty comfortable. Makes me feel special, honestly." Emily rolled her eyes, planting her hands on her hips. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it was a mistake. I didn't know who you were." "Really?" Brian's brow lifted in mock surprise. "That's unexpected." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because," he said with a small chuckle, "people usually know." Emily studied him for a moment. His response carried a weight she hadn't expected. "Are you saying you're used to being recognized?" she asked carefully. He exhaled a soft laugh. "Something like that. People tend to see my money first. Not that it bothers me. It's just part of the territory." For the first time, she noticed a hint of weariness in his tone. Despite his charm and confidence, there was something about him that seemed tired. "Well," she said after a pause, "I'm not people." His lips curved into a small smile. "That much I've noticed." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The silence that fell between them wasn't awkward. It was something else. Charged. Unnamed. Brian was the one to break it. "So," he said, tilting his head, "you work here?" "Yes," she replied. "And no, I'm not pretending to be a waitress as part of some grand scheme to investigate your secret life." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Good to know." Emily smiled back, but before she could say more, her manager's voice cut through the moment. "Emily!" With a sigh, she adjusted her apron. "Looks like I need to get back to work." Brian nodded, his gaze lingering. "It was a pleasure being your customer today. I hope we run into each other again." She hesitated, then smiled. A real one this time. "Let's hope it's without the mistaken hugs." His grin widened, and as she walked away, she had the unsettling feeling that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Over the next few days, Emily tried to convince herself that the strange encounter with Brian Carter was just a fluke. A bizarre, one-off incident. Yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That morning, she tied her apron around her waist, pulled her hair back, and took her usual spot behind the cafe counter. The day started like any other, with the hum of coffee grinders and the endless chatter of customers. Then, just as she turned to grab a tray, she saw him. Brian Carter. He entered the cafe as casually as if he were any other customer, but he wasn't. The air around him seemed to shift, drawing attention without him even trying. He chose a table near the counter and, deliberately, locked eyes with her. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "No," she muttered under her breath. Too late. Brian raised a hand, signaling her like she was his personal server. "Waitress!" he called, his tone playful. Emily clenched her jaw. He did not just do that. She considered ignoring him, but professionalism won out. Grabbing her notepad, she marched over, plastering a tight smile on her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "What can I get you today?" His grin was infuriatingly smug. "A coffee, but I want you to make it." Her brows shot up. "What?" "You heard me. I'd like you to make it personally." Crossing her arms, she eyed him skeptically. "Are you implying the coffee here isn't good enough?" "Not at all," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I just want to see if you're as good at making coffee as you are at giving awkward hugs." Her cheeks flushed. You're not going to let that go, are you? Definitely not. With an exaggerated huff, she scribbled down his order and stalked off to prepare it. A few minutes later, she returned, setting the steaming cup in front of him. Here it is, she said, crossing her arms. The best coffee this place has to offer. Made by me. Brian took a sip, his expression unreadable. Wow. Emily blinked. Wow as in good, or wow as in bad? His lips curved into a grin. Wow as in good, you're talented. Despite herself, Emily smiled a little. Well, I do work here. True, he admitted, but I didn't expect someone like you to be here. Her smile faltered. Someone like me? Leaning forward slightly, Brian rested his elbow on the table. You've got this spark, a determination that doesn't fit a regular job like this. You seem like you belong somewhere bigger. His words caught her off guard. Well, paying bills takes a lot of determination too. He laughed lightly. Fair point. Before she could respond, her manager, Mr. Phillips, appeared. His overly polite smile didn't match his usual stern demeanor. Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you here again, he said, his tone dripping with fake enthusiasm. I hope Emily's been taking good care of you. Brian glanced at Emily, his gray eyes twinkling. Very well, actually. She's excellent. Phillips's smile tightened as he turned to Emily. Good. Now, shouldn't you be getting back to work? Emily pressed her lips together and nodded, ready to walk away, but Brian spoke up. Wait. She paused, turning back to him. I'd like her to keep serving me, he said, looking directly at Phillips. The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Ah, of course, but we can't leave other customers waiting. Then have someone else cover for her, Brian replied smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily glanced between them, feeling the tension grow. Mr. Phillips, it's fine. I can handle the other tables, she said, trying to diffuse the situation. But Brian simply smiled. Relax, Emily. I enjoy our conversations. Phillips, visibly annoyed, walked away. Emily sighed, glancing back at Brian. He seemed thoroughly entertained by the entire ordeal. What are you up to? She asked quietly. He only smiled, sipping his coffee. Just enjoying myself. And with that, Emily knew. This man was trouble. Emily couldn't help but notice the whispers and glances from her co-workers whenever Brian Carter walked into the cafe. Some watched him with envy, others with curiosity, and a few even seemed annoyed, but none were more exasperated than Emily herself. It wasn't just her boss, Mr. Phillips, who seemed irritated by the attention Brian's presence brought. It was the fact that Brian kept coming back. What baffled her the most was why. Why would a private billionaire, someone who should have no time for idle cafe visits, come to the same cafe every day and ask for her specifically? It didn't make sense. That evening, as she wiped down the counter at the end of her shift, she felt an odd chill, the kind that came from knowing someone was watching you. Glancing toward the entrance, she saw him. Brian Carter. Again. Emily sighed, bracing herself for more teasing. But this time, he didn't head to his usual table. Instead, he walked straight up to the counter. I need a favor, he said, his tone casual. Emily blinked in confusion. A favor? From me? Yes. His lips curved into that signature mischievous smile. I want you to have dinner with me tonight. The cloth nearly slipped from her hand. What? Dinner, he repeated, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. You know, food, conversation, the usual. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Why on earth would I have dinner with you? Because I want to get to know you better, he said simply. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. And because you want to, too. You just won't admit it. Emily's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as she tried to find the right words. You are incredibly full of yourself. I've been told that before, Brian replied with a shrug. And you think I'm just going to say yes to an invitation like that? He smiled, his confidence unwavering. Yes, because I don't take no for an answer. Crossing her arms, she fought the strange flutter in her stomach. Well, that's your problem then. The answer is no. Unfazed, Brian picked up a napkin and jotted something down. Here's the address, he said, sliding it toward her. I'll be there at 8 p.m. If you don't show, I'll just assume you're scared of me. Emily snatched the napkin, rolling her eyes. Afraid of you? He tilted his head, his expression challenging. You don't seem like the type to back down from a challenge. Without waiting for her response, he walked out, leaving her staring at the piece of paper in her hand, her heart inexplicably racing. At exactly 7:59 p.m., Emily found herself standing in front of the restaurant Brian had mentioned. She had no idea why she was there. It was, by all accounts, a terrible idea. And yet, there she was. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The restaurant was elegant but understated, sophisticated without being flashy. It was the kind of place chosen to make someone feel comfortable, not overwhelmed. She scanned the room, and there he was, seated at a reserved table, impeccably dressed as always. When their eyes met, a small smile spread across his face. I didn't think you'd come, Brian said as she sat down across from him, crossing her arms. I almost didn't, she admitted. So why did you? He asked, leaning forward slightly. Emily hesitated, then sighed. Because you provoked me, and I'm not the type to back down from a challenge. Brian chuckled softly. I figured you'd say that. A waiter appeared, handing them menus. Emily's eyes widened as she glanced at the prices. I can't afford this. I know, Brian said simply, not even looking at the menu. Her gaze snapped to his. You know? Yes, and I didn't invite you here to make you pay. Emily narrowed her eyes. If you think I'm the kind of person who accepts expensive dinners as some kind of payment for attention, you're very mistaken. Brian shook his head with a slight smile. I figured you'd say that too. Closing the menu, she leaned back in her chair. Why am I here, Brian? What do you want from me? For a moment, he was silent. Then, leaning forward, he said, I want a conversation, a real one. No money, no status, just you and me. She crossed her arms, still suspicious. This doesn't make any sense. You have thousands of people around you. Why care about me? Brian studied her, his expression unreadable. Because you're different. Emily blinked, caught off guard. He continued. From the moment you accidentally hugged me, I realized you didn't care who I was. You treated me like just another person. She scoffed. Because I thought you were my brother. He smiled. Exactly. And even after you found out who I am, you stayed yourself. You didn't try to impress me or use me. You treat me like an ordinary man. And that's rare in my life. There was sincerity in his words that unsettled her. So, you want my friendship? Brian's eyes glinted with a playful spark. Let's start with that. Emily sighed, picking up the menu again. Fine, but I'm choosing the food. Fair enough. To her surprise, the dinner was pleasant. Brian wasn't what she had expected. He wasn't arrogant or showy. He listened, asked questions, and shared stories about his travels and childhood. Never in a way that felt superior, just like any regular person. For the first time in a long while, Emily found herself genuinely laughing. When the meal ended, Brian paid the bill without fanfare. As they stepped outside, the cool night air brushed against her skin, and she instinctively crossed her arms. Noticing this, Brian took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Emily blinked, startled. What are you doing? I don't want you to be cold, he said simply. She eyed him suspiciously. This isn't some weird attempt to win me over, is it? Brian chuckled softly. If I were trying to win you over, you'd know. Rolling her eyes, she accepted the jacket. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that felt oddly comfortable. Then Brian spoke, his voice softer than usual. I enjoyed tonight. Emily turned to him. What? Spending time with you, he said, his expression sincere. I enjoyed it. Her heart skipped a beat, and that wasn't a good sign. Because despite her best efforts, she realized she had enjoyed it too. The days that followed were a mix of routine and chaos. Emily tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, but ignoring Brian Carter became increasingly impossible. He kept showing up at the cafe, every day, at the same table, ordering the same coffee. And of course, insisting that she be the one to serve him. It was maddening, but deep down, Emily couldn't deny it. Brian wasn't giving up, and something told her that life was about to get a lot more complicated. Oliver had been complaining about pain for a few days, and Emily was starting to worry. He'd always been healthy, but something didn't feel right. She promised herself she'd take him to the doctor as soon as her shift ended. For now, though, she needed to focus on work. And, just like clockwork, Brian was already there. She sighed as she took his order and walked over to his table. You really don't have anywhere else to get coffee? She asked, placing his cup in front of him. Brian smiled, unfazed. I have plenty of options, but I like it here. Emily raised an eyebrow. I doubt that. And, he added, I like your company. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. You really don't give up, do you? Not at all, he replied with an easy grin. What do you get out of this? She asked, genuinely curious. Brian took a sip of his coffee, then said, I already told you. I like talking to you. It's refreshing. Emily rolled her eyes. You make it sound like I'm a summer breeze. Something like that, he said, his smile widening. Despite herself, Emily couldn't help but smile back. Later that evening, Emily rushed to pick up Oliver and took him straight to the hospital. A doctor saw them right away, and that's when everything changed. Your brother has a kidney issue, the doctor said, reviewing the test results. He'll need ongoing treatment and possibly a more serious procedure. Emily felt the ground fall out from under her. But he's always been healthy, she whispered. These things can happen, the doctor explained gently. But if we treat it quickly, he has a good chance of making a full recovery. And how much will it cost? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated before giving her the number. Emily's stomach dropped. It was far more than she could afford, not even close. Oliver noticed the look on her face and reached for her hand. Emily, don't worry, he said softly. She blinked back tears and forced a smile. It's going to be okay, she promised. But deep down, she had no idea how she was going to make that happen. The next day, Emily arrived at work exhausted, her mind racing with worry. Of course, Brian noticed the moment she brought him his coffee. What happened? He asked, his voice unusually serious. Nothing, she said quickly, brushing it off. Emily, he said, looking her straight in the eyes. Tell me. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, for the first time, she told him everything. About Oliver, the diagnosis, the treatment she couldn't afford. Brian listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he set his cup down and said, I'll pay for the treatment. Emily froze. What? I'll pay, he repeated. No debt, no favors, just because I can, and because I want to help. Emily stood up abruptly. No. Brian frowned. Emily, I don't take money from anyone, she said firmly. I'm not a charity case. This isn't charity, Brian said, leaning forward. It's a gesture. Well, I don't want your gesture, she snapped, turning to leave. Before she could walk away, he gently caught her wrist. Then let's make a deal, he said. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. What kind of deal? He let go of her wrist and leaned back. You cook for me for a week. I'll pay you for your time, enough to cover the medical expenses. Her eyes widened. Cook for you? Yes. At my apartment. 3 meals a day? 7 days? She blinked, trying to process it. This sounds like a weird deal. Think what you want, Brian said with a shrug. That's my offer. Emily hesitated. She hated the idea of accepting help, but she loved her brother more than anything. Taking a deep breath, she said the only thing she could. Deal. The next day, Emily showed up at the address Brian had given her, convinced it would be a straightforward arrangement. She couldn't have been more wrong. The building was a sleek, modern tower guarded by security. The entrance, with its towering glass doors, was intimidating. The doorman looked her up and down as if she didn't belong, but the moment she mentioned Brian Carter's name, she was escorted to a private elevator. When the doors opened, Emily was stunned. The apartment was massive, an architectural marvel of sleek lines, minimalist design, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. It looked like something out of a magazine, and there was Brian, sitting casually on a black leather couch with a cup of coffee in his hand, as if this were all perfectly normal. "Welcome," he said, his tone light. Emily crossed her arms. "Okay, this is ridiculous." Brian raised an eyebrow. "What's ridiculous?" She gestured around her. "This. The apartment, the view, the decor. Everything here looks too expensive to even exist." He smirked. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," she said, exasperated. "A normal place, not a mansion in the sky." He shrugged. "If you prefer, we can eat in the kitchen." Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Never mind. Where am I supposed to cook?" Brian pointed to a nearby door. "Over there." Following his gaze, she walked into the kitchen and nearly had a meltdown. It was a chef's dream. Gleaming surfaces, a massive stove, and every utensil imaginable. Everything sparkled, and it all looked ridiculously expensive. Turning to him, she asked incredulously, "Have you even used this kitchen?" Brian smiled. "Of course, I've walked through it a few times." Emily rolled her eyes. "Great. I work in a tiny cafe, and now I'm supposed to cook in what looks like a five-star restaurant." Brian tilted his head, his expression amused. "Can you handle it?" Emily clenched her jaw. "Watch me." Brian had been teasing her as usual. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" Emily said, pointing a finger at him. "I take on challenges, but if you become a difficult customer, I won't hesitate to throw a pan at you." Brian laughed, raising his hands in surrender. "Fair enough." The first few days of the deal were awkward, but manageable. Emily would arrive early each morning at Brian's luxurious apartment. She prepared breakfast, had lunch alone in the extravagant kitchen while he worked in another room, and finished with dinner. He never gave her specific requests, only saying, "Surprise me." And while she hated to admit it, Emily started to enjoy the challenge. As the days passed, she grew more accustomed to the opulent environment, the high-end ingredients, and the quiet hum of the space. But the strangest part wasn't the luxury. It was Brian. He began spending more time in the kitchen. At first, it was just him grabbing a coffee. Then, he started sitting at the counter, watching her cook. Eventually, their quiet coexistence turned into conversation. One evening, as she chopped vegetables, Brian asked casually, "Why did you choose to be a waitress?" Emily scoffed. "I didn't choose it. I needed a job." "And what would have been the right choice?" he pressed. She hesitated, her chopping slowing. "I don't know. Something I enjoyed, but not everyone has the luxury of choosing." Brian was silent for a moment before replying, "What if you did?" Emily stopped what she was doing and turned to him. "Why do you care?" He gave her a small, thoughtful smile. "Because I have everything money can buy, but I've never had the freedom to choose something I truly wanted." His words caught her off guard. For the first time, Emily saw him in a different light. Maybe Brian Carter, with all his wealth and privilege, was just as much a prisoner of his own life as she was of hers. On the fifth day, Brian surprised her. As she was preparing dinner, she noticed a dress lying on the counter, a stunning piece of fabric that screamed elegance. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. "A dress," he said, leaning against the counter. "Obviously." "But why?" "I have a charity event tomorrow night," he explained. "I want you to come with me." Emily froze, the dress still in her hands. "What?" "It'll be fun," he said with a playful grin. "Have you lost your mind?" she demanded. Probably, Brian admitted, his grin unfaltering. Emily shook her head, staring at the dress. I can't go? I don't belong in your world, Brian. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. And why not? She felt her stomach twist. This man was dangerous, not in the traditional sense, but in the way he made her question things she'd never dared to before. She hated to admit it, but deep down, she realized she wanted to go. And that terrified her. The next evening, Emily found herself sitting in Brian's car, heading to the event. The dress fit her perfectly, and when she stepped out of her room, Brian had visibly paused. What? She asked, feeling self-conscious. He blinked, seeming to regain his composure. Nothing. You just look beautiful. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. You probably say that to everyone. No, he said simply, a small smile on his lips. Unsure of how to respond, Emily pretended she hadn't heard him. When they arrived at the venue, Emily immediately felt out of place. The guests were dressed in designer clothes, the kind of outfits she'd only ever seen in magazines. Women glanced at her with thinly veiled judgment as if she didn't belong. But the worst part came when Brian's ex-girlfriend approached. Isabella, tall, blonde, and effortlessly elegant, gave Emily a condescending once-over before smiling. Brian, what a surprise to see you here, and with such an interesting companion. Emily felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but before she could say anything, Brian did something unexpected. He intertwined his fingers with hers and said, She's not my companion. She's my guest, and if you have a problem with that, maybe you should find another table. Emily froze, staring at him in disbelief. For the first time, Brian was openly standing up for her. Around them, Isabella's smile faltered, and the whispers from the other guests died down. Emily wasn't sure why it affected her so much, but her heart was pounding. Why did Brian care so much about defending her? They barely knew each other, or maybe, in some unspoken way, he saw her differently. Come on, he murmured, letting go of her hand but staying close by. Let's get something to drink. Emily nodded, trying to ignore the judgmental stares still lingering on her. She never thought she'd be stepping into Brian's world, and part of her wasn't sure she wanted to. But when she looked at him, at the way his gray eyes studied her as if silently making sure she was okay, she felt something strange. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to stay by his side, even if it was a mistake. The next day, Emily's name was everywhere. She didn't have to check social media to know. It was clear from the way her coworkers stared at her when she walked into the cafe. Their expressions ranged from surprise to envy to thinly veiled judgment. Emily, one of them asked, were you at an event with Brian Carter last night? Another chimed in, and that dress, did he buy it for you? Did you see Isabella's post about you? Someone else added, shoving a phone in her direction. Emily wanted to disappear. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her phone and opened social media. The first thing she saw was a photo of her and Brian together. The second was the flood of comments. Who is this nobody? Looks like Brian's fallen for a gold digger. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the remarks, each one more cutting than the last. She locked her phone and took a deep breath. For a moment, she questioned if stepping into Brian's world had been worth it at all. Emily scrolled through the comments under the photo of her and Brian, her stomach twisting with each word. Another gold digger's trap. She's just someone he'll toss aside in a few days. She shoved her phone into her bag, her face burning. She never wanted any of this. The attention, the stares, the gossip. Now she was right in the middle of it. The giggles and whispers from her coworkers didn't help, and her patience was wearing thin. By the end of the day, she felt drained. When Brian walked into the cafe with his usual confident stride, Emily's frustration bubbled over. He looked calm, as if he didn't have a care in the world, used to being judged, stared at, and talked about. But she wasn't. She wasn't built for this kind of spotlight, and her anger took over. As soon as he reached the counter, she leaned forward and muttered, "We need to talk." Brian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Here?" No, she hissed, her tone sharp. Seeing the seriousness in her expression, he nodded. Let's go somewhere quieter. 10 minutes later, they stood in a nearby park. Emily didn't waste any time. Do you have any idea what you've done? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Brian tilted his head. I defended you. No, she snapped. You threw me into your world, and I don't want to be in it, Brian. I never asked for this. He stayed silent for a moment, then let out a sigh. Is that what's really bothering you? Or is it what people are saying? Emily closed her eyes, trying to steady her frustration. I don't want to be a scandal. I don't want to be a headline. I just want my normal life back. Brian studied her carefully, his expression thoughtful. Then, he said something that took her by surprise. But you've never wanted a normal life, Emily. Her eyes snapped open, stunned. What? You've always wanted more, he continued, his tone calm but firm. You've always had dreams, ambitions, something beyond what you were given. But now, because a few people are criticizing you, you're letting fear win. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. As much as she wanted to deny it, deep down, she knew he was right, but admitting it felt impossible. Then, Brian made a mistake. He reached out to touch her, perhaps to comfort her, but Emily instinctively pulled back. The movement was automatic, but it was enough to change his expression. For a brief moment, she saw hurt flash across his face. I need to go, she said quickly, her voice barely audible. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in silence. Something inside her felt like it was breaking, but she didn't dare look back. The next day, Emily tried her best not to think about Brian. She tried to forget his words, the way he seemed to see her fears so clearly, and the way he looked at her with an understanding that felt far too personal. But forgetting Brian Carter was impossible. That afternoon, as she wiped down the cafe counter, she overheard a coworker talking about a familiar name. The Carter Corporation bought up a bunch of businesses years ago, including that restaurant downtown, one said casually. Emily froze mid-motion. What restaurant? She asked, trying to sound casual, though her heart was racing. Her coworker turned to her, surprised. You know, the one your family used to own? Didn't you know? Carter Corporation caused it to shut down. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words hung heavy in the air. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her family's restaurant, the one her parents had poured their hearts into, the place where she'd spent so much of her childhood, had been taken away because of Brian's company. She couldn't breathe. The anger surged through her so fiercely that she didn't even stop to think. She grabbed her bag and stormed out of the cafe, hailing a cab and heading straight for Brian's apartment. When Brian opened the door and saw her face, his expression immediately shifted. Emily? It was you, she blurted, her voice trembling. Your company destroyed my family's restaurant. Brian's face went still, and the silence that followed was deafening. He didn't deny it, and that hurt more than anything else. Emily took a step back, her chest tightening. It was just a game to you, wasn't it? You knew from the start. That's not true, Brian said, his voice more serious than she'd ever heard. Emily, listen to me. No. She cut him off, her voice breaking. I don't want to hear it. She couldn't handle it. The man who had made her laugh, who had challenged her, who had stirred feelings she didn't want to admit, was the same man who had destroyed a part of her family's history. And in that moment, something inside her shattered. She looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with pain. Then she turned and walked away, refusing to let him see the tears threatening to spill. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Emily didn't stop walking until she was out of Brian's building and into a cab. She stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, her chest tight with anger and hurt. How could he have kept something like this from her? He had to have known. And yet, he said nothing. When she finally reached home, she found Oliver sprawled on the couch, watching TV. You okay? He asked, noticing her expression. Emily forced a smile. Yeah, just tired. Oliver frowned, unconvinced. You sure? You never come home looking this upset. She took a deep breath, trying to push her emotions aside. I'm fine, Ollie. Want to have dinner? He nodded, but continued watching her with concern. Emily knew she couldn't let him see how much this was affecting her. The last thing he needed was to worry about her, especially with everything he was already going through. As she prepared dinner, her mind raced. The fragile trust she'd built with Brian was gone, shattered in seconds. And yet, despite her anger, a part of her couldn't stop thinking about him. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't ignore the weight of what had just happened, or the unanswered questions it left behind. Brian disappeared. He didn't show up at the cafe. No texts, no calls, nothing. Emily tried to convince herself that this was for the best, but every time she walked into the cafe and saw the empty table where he used to sit, a pang of something unexplainable struck her chest. She shouldn't care. He had lied to her, deceived her. So why did she miss him so much? She buried herself in work, trying to drown out the lingering ache. But deep down, she knew something inside her was broken. And the worst part? She had no idea how to fix it. A week later, Emily was closing the cafe when she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Without looking up, she called out, "We're closed." "I know," a familiar voice said, "but I needed to talk to you." Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned around. There he was. Brian. But he looked different. The usual confidence in his eyes was gone, replaced with something raw and vulnerable. He looked tired, like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Emily wanted to tell him to leave, but her heart betrayed her. She wanted to hear what he had to say. "Please, just listen," he said, his voice hoarse. Emily crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "Say what, Brian? That you knew about my family's restaurant from the start? That you got close to me out of guilt?" He closed his eyes briefly, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that." "Then explain." He took a deep breath. "I didn't know about your family's restaurant until a few days ago. I don't handle all of the company acquisitions, Emily. When I found out, I was just as shocked as you were." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But trust didn't come that easily anymore. "Why should I believe you?" Brian hesitated, then said softly, "Because I've never lied about how I feel about you." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to hear those words, but a part of her desperately needed them to be true. He took a step closer. "I never wanted you to hate me, Emily, but if that's the price of being honest with you, I'll accept it." Before she could respond, Brian placed an envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. Brian didn't answer. He just gave her one last look, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place, and left. With trembling hands, Emily opened the envelope. Inside was a contract, and with it, the deed to her family's restaurant. Her heart stopped. Brian had bought it back and put it in her name. It was hers again. Her legs nearly gave out as the weight of it hit her. The place her parents had poured their lives into, the place that had been stolen from them, was finally hers once more. Emily didn't sleep that night. She spent hours staring at the contract, overwhelmed by emotions. She thought about Brian, his actions, his words, and the quiet way he'd left without asking for anything in return. He had given her back a piece of her life, trying to fix what had been broken. By morning, she knew what she needed to do. When Brian opened the door to his apartment, he looked surprised to see her standing there. Before he could say anything, Emily stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Emily," he began, but she interrupted him. She looked him straight in the eyes and did something even she hadn't expected. She hugged him. Brian froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard, but then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just wanted you to have what was always yours," he said softly, pulling her closer. Emily pulled back slightly to look at him. "Does this change things?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Brian said nothing, his gray eyes searching hers. Then, he gave her the only answer that mattered. It only changes if you want it to. Her heart raced. She didn't know when the walls she'd built around herself had started to crack, but in that moment, she stopped fighting it. Because deep down, she knew the answer. When Brian leaned in slowly, his lips just a breath away from hers, she didn't pull back. For the first time, she let herself want this, want him. And she had nothing left to deny. Emily never imagined her life would change so drastically in such a short time. For years, she'd fought to survive, balancing endless shifts at the cafe, paying bills, and caring for Oliver. But now, she had something she hadn't dared to dream of: hope. And with that hope came the terrifying realization that her life wasn't just hers anymore. It was intertwined with someone else's. Someone who had managed to break down her defenses, piece by piece, and show her that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than the life she'd been fighting so hard to hold together. Emily had never allowed herself the luxury of dreaming. Her life was too full of responsibilities and struggles to imagine anything beyond what she already had. But now, holding the contract for her family's restaurant, something Brian had given back to her, she felt something shift. For the first time, she had a choice. She could accept what Brian had done, rebuild her family's legacy, and move forward without him. Or she could face the undeniable truth stirring within her. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, Brian Carter affected her in ways no one else ever had. He challenged her, frustrated her, made her laugh, and showed her a side of himself that seemed willing to change for her. And that terrified her. Needing time to think, Emily did what she always did when the world became too much. She went home, hugged Oliver tightly, and tried to pretend her life wasn't in complete chaos. But the universe had other plans. That night, her phone rang. It was late, and the moment she saw the hospital's number on the screen, her heart dropped. She answered immediately, fear gripping her chest. "Ms. Green," the doctor's voice was calm but urgent. "Oliver has taken a turn for the worse. We need you to come in right away." Emily felt her legs weaken as panic overtook her. She grabbed her bag and ran out the door, barely aware of the tears streaming down her face. The fear of losing her brother consumed her. He was her only family, the one thing that truly mattered. When she reached the hospital, she ran down the halls, her breath ragged, until she found the doctor who had called. "Oliver's condition has worsened," he explained gravely. "He needs an urgent procedure. Without it, he's at serious risk." Her world blurred as panic took over. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The doctor hesitated. "The procedure is costly. Even with what you've saved, it won't be enough." Emily collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She didn't have time to think, no time to plan. And then, one name came to her mind. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed Brian's number. He answered after the second ring. "Emily?" His voice was filled with concern. She tried to speak, but her words were shaky, her emotions overwhelming her. "It's Oliver. He needs surgery, but I don't have enough money." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Brian's steady voice broke through. "I'm on my way." When Brian arrived at the hospital, he looked as calm and determined as ever, but his gray eyes carried an intensity Emily hadn't seen before. Without hesitation, he went straight to the doctor, signed the necessary paperwork, and ensured that Oliver received the best care possible. Emily wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need his money, that she didn't want to owe him anything. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was saving Oliver's life. The surgery lasted for hours. Emily sat in the waiting room, her legs restless and her heart pounding with fear. Brian stayed by her side the entire time. He didn't try to talk when she needed silence. Instead, he simply held her hand when her emotions overwhelmed her. When the doctor finally came out and announced that the surgery had been a success, Emily felt tears stream down her face. The relief was so overwhelming she almost collapsed. Without thinking, she turned to Brian and hugged him. But this wasn't the same kind of hug as the one she had mistakenly given him at the airport. This one wasn't out of desperation or embarrassment. It was filled with gratitude and something else. Something growing inside her that she couldn't ignore anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Brian's arms tightened around her, his warmth grounding her in a moment of chaos. "Always," he murmured softly. She pulled back slightly to look at him. This changes things." Brian didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her with that calm, steady gaze of his, and then he said, "It only changes if you want it to." Her heart raced at his words, and for the first time, Emily wasn't afraid of what she wanted. She wasn't afraid of him. When Brian leaned in slightly, their faces close, she didn't pull away. She let herself feel what she'd been trying to suppress for so long. In the days that followed, Oliver's condition improved steadily. Emily spent every waking moment by his side, ensuring he was comfortable and cared for. But Brian never disappeared. He continued to help, working in the background to organize everything Oliver needed without ever asking for anything in return. He never brought up the money he'd spent or acted as if she owed him something. And that confused Emily even more because it made her see a side of him she hadn't fully understood before. Brian wasn't just the wealthy man who'd shaken up her life. He was someone who genuinely cared, someone willing to fight for the people he cared about. And for the first time, Emily began to see him, not as the man who had disrupted her world, but as someone who could become part of it. Emily never thought she'd find herself sitting under the stars with Brian Carter, but there she was. The cool night air surrounded her as she sat on a bench outside the hospital, hugging her knees to her chest. She had come out to clear her mind, while Oliver slept peacefully inside. The stars above twinkled brightly, offering a strange kind of comfort. Footsteps interrupted the silence, and she looked up to see Brian approaching. He sat beside her without a word, giving her space before speaking. "You look tired," he said softly. She let out a small, bitter laugh. "I am, but Oliver's getting better, and that's all that matters." Brian nodded, his eyes steady on hers. "And you? How are you?" Emily turned to look at him, really look at him, under the soft glow of the hospital lights. His face, usually so composed, now carried traces of worry and exhaustion. He seemed genuinely concerned, as he always did. And it was in that quiet moment that Emily realized she wasn't fighting her feelings anymore. The walls she had so carefully built were gone, and she didn't know when they had fallen. Brian Carter wasn't just someone who had disrupted her life. He had become essential to it. She leaned forward slightly, watching his reaction. Brian didn't move. He just waited, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. And then, with a deep breath, Emily kissed him. It was soft and hesitant at first, but when Brian responded, pulling her closer, everything felt right. His hands cupped her face, the kiss deepened, and for the first time, Emily felt something she didn't know she needed: warmth, safety, belonging. When they pulled apart, Brian rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "Does this mean you're done running?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I think so." Brian stroked her cheek gently, his gray eyes filled with something she couldn't name. But in that moment, she didn't need to. For the first time, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night, Emily admitted to herself that she loved Brian Carter. And this time, there was no denying it. The days that followed were different, lighter, as if that kiss had shifted something fundamental between them. Brian stayed by her side, not just for Oliver's recovery, but for her as well. Their conversations were easier, their glances more meaningful, their goodbyes harder. When Oliver was finally discharged from the hospital, it was a day of pure relief and joy. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. The restaurant was now officially in Emily's name, and it was time for her to decide what to do with it. As always, Brian was there when she stepped into the space for the first time since it had closed. The scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled the air. Emily walked through the dusty halls, her fingers grazing the surfaces of tables covered in old sheets. Every corner of the restaurant held a piece of her childhood, of her family's story. It was overwhelming, but it also felt like coming home. Brian stood silently, giving her the space she needed. When she turned to him, a small smile formed on her lips, and she felt a new sense of determination. "I want to reopen this place." Brian nodded as if he had already known her decision. "Then let's make it happen." Her smile faltered slightly. "We?" He shrugged, crossing his arms casually. "I know a little about business. Maybe I can help?" Emily narrowed her eyes, suspicious. "Are you trying to be my business partner, Carter?" Brian laughed, stepping closer. "Maybe I just want an excuse to stick around." Her heart raced again, and without thinking, she said, "You don't need a reason." The words came out before she could stop them, but when she saw the light in his eyes, she knew she meant them. Brian wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer. "Then I guess I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Emily smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. The restaurant would reopen, Oliver was safe, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be happy without fear. But fate wasn't done surprising her. The next evening, Brian took her out to dinner. He said he wanted to celebrate, but Emily could sense something different about him. He seemed nervous, a rare sight for someone usually so composed. The restaurant he chose wasn't extravagant. It was cozy, with soft lighting and an intimate atmosphere. Perfect for them. Halfway through dinner, Brian reached into his pocket and placed a small box on the table. Emily's heart stopped. She stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. "Brian," she whispered, her voice shaky. He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring that sparkled under the warm light. Taking a deep breath, Brian spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Emily, I've never been the kind of man who follows rules. I've never been good at showing what I feel. But you changed everything. I don't want to imagine my life without you anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes as he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "Will you marry me? Not because it's the logical next step, not because it makes sense, but because I know it's you. I know I want you in my life forever." Emily felt the tears spill over as her heart threatened to burst. Brian had always been the one to challenge her, to push her out of her comfort zone. But in that moment, he wasn't asking her to do the impossible. He was simply asking her to choose happiness. She smiled through her tears and nodded. Yes. The word came out without hesitation, without fear. Brian laughed, sliding the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a kiss that was full of promises. The restaurant would reopen. They were together. And for the first time in years, Emily felt like her life was finally falling into place. Their fate was sealed, and Emily could hardly believe it. The night before, Brian Carter, the man who had completely upended her life and captured her heart, had proposed to her, and she had said yes. No hesitation, no fear, just certainty. After years of running from love, doubting people's intentions, and shielding herself to avoid getting hurt, she had finally found someone worth taking the risk for. But saying yes to Brian wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The next morning was chaos. Emily's phone wouldn't stop ringing. First, Oliver freaked out when he heard the news. Protective as ever, it took her some effort to convince him that marrying Brian wasn't a terrible mistake. Then, there was the restaurant, which had become her top priority. With renovations in full swing, Emily was working harder than ever to ensure everything was perfect for the reopening. Brian, as he had promised, was right by her side. His involvement in the renovations surprised her. For someone accustomed to luxury and corporate life, Brian adapted surprisingly well. He helped choose furniture, attended meetings with suppliers, and even put on an apron to test recipes with her. Emily couldn't help but laugh when she saw him with flour on his face, grumbling about how hard cooking was. What impressed her most, though, was his patience. He didn't try to control anything or impose his opinions. He simply supported her, like a true partner. But, as expected, not everything went smoothly. News of their engagement hit the media like wildfire. Within hours, tabloids and websites speculated about every detail. Who was Emily? What did Brian Carter see in her? How long would this last? And of course, there was Isabella. Brian's ex wasted no time stirring the pot. She gave interviews, suggesting Emily was taking advantage of Brian's wealth and that he was blinded by infatuation. Emily tried to ignore it all, but it wasn't easy. One night, Brian found her sitting alone at the restaurant, staring at her phone with a tired, defeated expression. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, sitting down beside her. Emily hesitated before replying. "I'm trying to be." Brian gently took the phone from her hands, glancing at the headlines without any visible reaction. "All this," she sighed, her voice shaky. "It feels like I've lost control of my life. I used to just be an ordinary girl, Brian. Now, to the world, I'm just Brian Carter's fiancée. It's like I'm not myself anymore." He stayed silent for a moment, then said, "You're still the same person you've always been. These people don't know you. They only see what they want to see." She looked at him uncertainly. "And what do you see?" Brian gave her a lopsided smile. "I see the girl who hugged the wrong guy at the airport and turned my life upside down. And I've never been more grateful for a mistake." Despite everything, Emily laughed. "Me too." Brian took her hand, kissed her fingers, and said, "Let me handle this." She frowned. "Brian, I don't need you to solve my problems." "I know," he said calmly, "but sometimes letting someone help doesn't mean you're weak. It means you trust them." Emily realized he was right. She had spent so much time building walls to protect herself that she'd forgotten accepting help could also be a sign of strength. The next day, Brian gave an exclusive interview to shut down the rumors. He spoke candidly about how he and Emily had met, her dedication to her family's restaurant, and how their relationship had nothing to do with money or status. He was direct, sincere, and left no room for gossip when he called Emily the love of his life. The real turning point, however, came when Isabella made one last attempt to insert herself into Brian's life. She showed up at an event he attended, but he completely ignored her. Not a glance, not a word. For the first time, the woman who always thought she had control realized she no longer had a place in his life. And for the first time, Emily felt that chapter was truly closed. A week later, the restaurant was ready. The grand opening was an emotional event. Oliver, standing proudly by Emily's side, helped coordinate everything. Brian was there too, watching the woman he loved achieve her dream. When the doors opened and the first customers walked in, Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. She had done it. The restaurant was back in business, and her heart was full. That night, after a long day of work, Brian took her to the restaurant's balcony. The stars twinkled above as he turned to her, a playful smile on his face. "I told you it would be a good investment," he teased. Emily smiled back. "The restaurant or me?" He laughed, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Both." She leaned into him, her arms draped around his neck. "I never imagined my life would lead me here." Brian cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Now that you're here, what do you want?" She didn't hesitate. "I want you." Brian smiled before leaning in to kiss her, and in that moment, Emily knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Time seemed to fly after Emily said yes. The restaurant was thriving, Oliver was healthy, and Brian was still there, a constant presence that felt like the missing piece of her life. But with the wedding approaching, Emily often found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. How had one simple mistake at the airport completely changed her life? Wedding preparations began almost immediately, and Emily quickly realized how overwhelming they could be. Invitations, dresses, catering, decorations. It was a whirlwind of decisions she never imagined she'd have to make. One evening, she collapsed onto Brian's couch, surrounded by a mountain of wedding magazines. "I never thought planning a wedding would be this hard," she groaned. Brian sat beside her, flipping through a magazine with a grin. "You know, we could just elope and get married in secret." Emily looked at him, startled by the suggestion. Then, she laughed. "As tempting as that sounds, Brian Carter, I think we'll stick with the plan." He laughed along with her, pulling her close. "Whatever you want, Emily. I'm just happy to be with you." And that was all she needed to hear. Emily shot Brian a playful look. "Do you really think Oliver would forgive me if we ran off and eloped?" Brian grimaced, then chuckled. "Fair point. But if all this wedding planning is getting too stressful, let me help." She sighed and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You already help, just by being here." He gave her hand a tender squeeze in return. "I just want this day to be perfect for you." Emily smiled, knowing that with Brian by her side, no matter what happened, the day would already be perfect. The news of their wedding spread quickly, capturing the attention of newspapers and gossip sites alike. Every outlet speculated about the details, from the venue to the dress, while others couldn't help but rehash comparisons to Isabella. Emily tried to tune out the noise, but seeing her name in the headlines, questioning her intentions or worth, was difficult. But Brian was there, steady as always, to remind her what truly mattered. "The only opinion that matters is ours," he said, cupping her face in his hands and gazing into her eyes. "Nothing else makes a difference." And he was right. The big day arrived faster than Emily had anticipated. She stood in front of the mirror, her heart racing. Her dress was everything she'd wanted, simple, elegant, with soft fabric that draped perfectly over her figure. Her hair was styled in a delicate updo, with a few loose strands framing her face. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Oliver walked into the room and froze. "Wow," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You look amazing." Emily turned to him, her eyes softening as she fought back tears. "Thank you, Ollie." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I've never seen you this happy." She nodded, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I am happy." He smiled back, his tone turning teasing. "Then I guess you're ready to marry that arrogant billionaire?" She burst into laughter. "Definitely." The ceremony was held in a lush outdoor garden, surrounded by vibrant flowers and strings of delicate lights. The scene felt almost magical. As Emily walked down the aisle, she was aware of the guests' eyes on her, but her gaze was locked on Brian. He stood at the altar, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that radiated love. When she reached him, Brian took her hands and whispered, "You look breathtaking." Emily's heart fluttered as she smiled at him. She barely heard the officiant begin to speak. All she could focus on was the man standing in front of her, the man who had changed her life in ways she'd never imagined. "Emily," the officiant said, drawing her attention back, "do you take Brian as your husband, to love and honor him for all the days of your life?" Emily met Brian's eyes and felt a wave of certainty wash over her. "Yes." The officiant turned to Brian. "Brian, do you take Emily as your wife, to love and honor her for all the days of your life?" Brian's smile grew impossibly wider. "Yes. Forever." As their vows were sealed with a kiss, the air filled with applause and cheers from their friends and family. But Emily only felt Brian, the way his hands gently cradled her face, the warmth of his lips, and the overwhelming sense of being home. The reception was a joyful celebration. Laughter and music filled the air as guests toasted to the happy couple. Oliver gave a heartfelt speech, sharing how he had never seen Emily so happy and joking that Brian hadn't just gained a wife, but also a little brother. Brian, ever playful, responded, "I never wanted a younger brother, but I guess I can make an exception for Oliver." The night was filled with dancing, toasts, and endless smiles. Emily felt surrounded by love and hope for the future. At the end of the night, when the guests had left and the world felt still, Brian pulled Emily into a tight embrace. "You're officially my wife now," he murmured, his voice filled with emotion. Emily smiled, resting her head against his chest. "And you're officially my husband." Brian leaned down to kiss her, his lips soft against hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for changing my life." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with love. "You changed mine too." In that quiet moment, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, forever. What did you think of Emily and Brian's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking on the final screen.